So before I left class a little while ago, I told the students that if they saw persons from the administration building running out with pitchforks and flares to, come save me. I also have to relate in the sense that energy policy is rather an emerging field in political science. It hadn't been around for a long time. And to give you some sense of how energy policy has emerged over the last 10 years or so, excuse me, is that I always tell the story that when I first went to the Western Political Science Conference and was going to present my beginnings of my study on the political conflicts between ranchers and energy developers in the Rocky Mountain West due to expanded hydraulic fracturing activities on private lands, they shoved me into a conference with studies done on ecotourism. And I was listening to these really interesting talks about the Serengeti and ecotourism, how it benefited the community, and Vietnamese rainforest and how ecotourism benefited the society. And I got up and said, well, I'm going to talk about cows. I really don't know if that's necessarily an exotic animal to anyone, outside of the Rocky Mountain West or maybe West Texas, but that's how it's kind of gone. However, years later, you get shoved into a conference panel with ecotourism, and years later, there's 6 panel representatives talking about energy policy, and we've got 50 people in the room at 8 in the morning. Things have changed. And that's kind of the central topic about what I'm going to talk about today with regard to energy policy and climate change, is that things change. I'm going to start with a very brief exercise. This is what happens, that you don't want to go through an IRB process. So this is something I'm working on. Throw out the word environmentalist. What is, and you got to help me out, so what is the very first thing that comes to your mind when you see the term environmentalist or hear the term environmentalist?
Anti-business.
Anti-business. Green, what else?
Peace.
Greenpeace. Hippies. What else? Granola. Tree huggers. What else? Academia, yeah. Pitchforks and torches. The others that I've heard of, Gorites. It's kind of favorite, right? The Rainbow Family. Anti-development. My favorite, though, to this day is the Granola Mafia. I do this exercise for students, and I do it for a reason. And if you notice that all the terminology was, sort of slanted to the left, this idea that they're anti-business. Environmentalists are anti-business. They're granola crunching, dirty hippies, so on and so forth. John, you'd be proud of me today. I knew I was following you, so I wore shoes instead of sandals. But this idea is that in our policy world, that oftentimes terms are dictated by symbolism. The symbolism that attaches to a particular social construct of what is and what isn't in terms of reality. So what I didn't hear from anybody was ranchers, developers, ATV riders, hunters, fishermen. You go down that list, and if you look at all their organizations and their mission statements and you interact with a lot of these folks, you'll come to find that they all have some environmental part of their mission or environmental sense of things, or this idea that they want to protect the lands and resources. And so the argument then that I make is that while we've come to symbolize environmentalism with a particular aspect of our society, the bottom line is that when you really look deeper, we're all environmentalists in some vein. So what has my research told me over time? Well, in political science and public policy, what it's told me over time is that there's 4 primary conditions that, in a sense, engender the use of technologies to go after scarcer and scarcer resources. And one is energy markets. So anytime we see a spike in energy prices, for example, from 1999 to 2000, we saw an incredible spike in energy prices. It just did nothing to abate itself. So energy markets, if it's economically viable for energy companies to employ the technology that they've developed and make a reasonable amount of profit, they're going to employ those technologies. The other thing is that you've got sort of pressuring the policy domain, is that this idea that citizens are pressuring elected officials to do something about it. One of the easiest things that they can do is sort of give free rein over to energy development companies to go out and use these technologies to develop harder and harder to reach and develop resources. So tied in with that is energy technology. Fracking's been around, hydraulic fracturing has been around for quite some time, but the modern sense of hydraulic fracturing has only been with us since about the mid-90s. And it's been widely deployed as time's gone by. So starting in about 2003, 2004, hydraulic fracturing process, as well as horizontal, or what's known as directional drilling, and the technology developed surrounding both of those areas, began to be deployed in the Rocky Mountain West to a much larger degree than what had ever been seen, both on public lands, but also it began to encroach on private lands. Because, quite frankly, in the Rocky Mountain West, 82 million acres of land are what are referred to as split estates, where you as a private landowner may own the surface, but the federal government or some other entity owns the mineral rights. Under U.S. law, the mineral estate, the economic development of that mineral estate takes legal precedence over the economic development and use of the surface estate. Hence, you started seeing conflicts between ranchers and energy developers, something we'd never seen in the West before. I'm from Utah and Wyoming, so this was unusual. We also began to see a lot of the ranching organizations begin to reach out to the environmental organizations seeking their assistance to ward off this sort of encroachment upon their economic well-being as well as the use of their lands and resources. Again, a very unusual coalition was beginning to develop. The third is energy law and regulation. Charles Wilkinson refers to a lot of our energy law and a lot of our natural resource development law as the lords of yesterday. And in essence, we have in the 1872, if you go back to the 1872 General Mining Law, the 1916 Stock Raising Homestead Act, this is where the split estates come from, the 1920 Minerals Leasing Act, and 1934 Taylor Grazing Act, and then you get into the 1976 Federal Lands Policy Management Act. In essence, those are the big pieces of legislation. Those are the big pieces of law. And if you notice, most of them, especially the extractive sort of orientation of natural resources, all go to the turn of the century, late 19th, early 20th century law. Regulations are developed by administrative agencies in such a way that is in keeping with the intent of the law. So this is why you have agencies like the Bureau of Land Management that sort of lean towards that development aspect, even though under the Federal Lands Policy Management Act of 76, they're supposed to have a multiple use doctrine. Nevertheless, they're also charged with a conflicting mission and the idea that they're there to generate economic activity. We know over time that the ranching industry basically took control of or dominated the Bureau of Land Management. It was one reason of instilling their mission with the multiple use doctrine. And at times when you had economic as well as legal equity, a pound on the hoof was basically the equivalent of a barrel of oil. Well, that changed, and that changed dramatically. So consequently, what I saw, my findings indicated, is that we saw a profound shift in the dominance of what we refer to as the sub-government policymaking environment of the BLM. We saw a shift in the typology and the hierarchical structure of the interest groups that were working within that sub-government. No longer was ranching necessarily at the top of the hierarchy. Energy had displaced ranching in controlling for that policy agenda. And finally, you have to have political willpower. And the fourth aspect of this. The fourth aspect is that you look at the energy markets, you've got pressure from the public. It's not all ties together in a sense. You have pressure from the public, you also have pressure for economic activity and profitability of the energy companies. You have the energy technology available to you to go out into the field and extract these harder and harder to reach resources. You've got a body of law and regulation that lends itself to the deployment of these new technologies and the development of those resources. And then you have to have the political willpower. So the executive branch, through executive action, unilateral use of their powers by appointment powers, executive orders, et cetera. And then you've also got to have the Congress go in line with you. So in 2005, you have the Energy Policy Act that carved out what's infamously known as the Halliburton loophole, which exempted all hydraulic fracturing activities in terms of the development side of things from just about every environmental law we've ever passed. Clean Air, Clean Water, Clean Drinking Water Act, Surface Reclamation Act, any of these bodies of law that we viewed as fundamentally important to offset the unfettered development of natural resources over time, the hydraulic fracturing process is now exempt from. And that's going to play into when I start talking about the inverse relationship with depletion of energy resources, the increasingly interesting engineering that's involved in the energy technology to go after scarcer and scarcer resources, and the inverse relationship that has when it talks about compounding our environmental problems and then reaching all the way up into aspects of climate change. in a sense, in my world and from my view, I view that our resolution to the problems of climate change are, in a sense, very intertwined with how we go about thinking about our energy policy, thinking about either reforming it or altering it. And this is going to take either incremental shifts in the existing policy of bodies of law and regulation, the closing of those exemptions, or quite frankly, cultural shifts of such a scale that it's kind of hard to imagine that they actually occur. I know that our previous speaker, is it David? Yeah, David was talking about this new urban design, and I'm going to get into a little bit of that. And I know that Dr. Zach talked about tar sands. I'm going to get into tar sands a little bit. So where does energy go? What are we using it for? And I'm going to stick on in terms of the fossil fuels right now, and renewables. But if you look at this chart, you'll see petroleum, natural gas, coal, renewable energy, and then nuclear electric power. And it goes to the various sectors of our activities, economic and otherwise, just daily lives. And by the numbers, you can see the percent of the resources being used by the various sectors. So in this graph, basically fossil fuels and all fuels, transportation's using up 28% of it, industrial 21%, and electric power, obviously we kind of get a sense of that 40%, where we got the various different types of fuels that are actually a part of this side of this right-hand side of the graph. I think with 36% of petroleum, 26% in natural gas, and 20% in coal. If you notice, nuclear renewable, rather marginal influence on these areas. So when I talk about shift in energy policy, this is kind of what I'm getting at. How do we alter from fossil fuel dependency to renewable dependency? In a sense, we're talking about a paradigm shift in our entire economic and social paradigm. Not easy to do. In terms of consumption, this is increasing. The United States uses up currently about 20 million barrels of oil a day. And you see an increase. Oil remains the largest share. Natural gas, because natural gas is not as plentiful, shall we say, as oil. The other thing is that natural gas, quite frankly, is a little bit more difficult to get at. Nuclear, incredibly expensive. Hydro, it comes with its own environmental trade-offs. Geo and biomass, the same sort of sense of things. It's not as big in terms of the production and the use as is oil. And I always pose this question to my students, is that, are we ever going to have a society that doesn't use oil? No. Quite frankly, no. But how much oil we actually use, that makes a difference. It makes an enormous difference. So, narrowing the energy gap. This is that idea that energy is a two-sided coin. And the way you get after energy, or at least consumption and production, and trying to narrow that gap and shift over to renewables and alternative fuels, is that you have to go at it from two sides. One is from the consumptive side, and then the other is from the deliverable side, the efficiency side. So we're always looking for ways to reduce our consumption, and we're always looking for ways to increase the efficiency by which the energy is delivered. So here in the United States, we've seen an increase in terms of our efficient use of it. We've also seen a reduction in our consumption. So the question then comes to bear is that, well, then why are we still developing so many of these resources? And this goes back to the energy markets. Energy markets are global markets. And one of the things that we depend on in terms of a global market is being able to supply enough energy resources in order to maintain a relatively stable price for the energy. We can reduce as much as we want in terms of our energy consumption, but if you talk to any of the executives at Exxon, they'll tell you that that's fine. They don't care. The reason being is because there are other countries who are trying to raise their standard of living through economic development that are more than willing to purchase that excess energy. So consequently, us reducing our own consumption probably only does us some good. We have to think about it in terms of not just changing and shifting our society, but having influence and changing other societies as well. And it starts with this idea of energy policy, at least in my mind. So what I look at traditionally in terms of policy and how policy changes is this idea of the sub-government policymaking environment. And I've kind of drawn it out here just a little bit to get some idea of competitive hierarchies and what incentivizes persons or groups of persons to behave in certain ways, vote in certain ways. They have patterns. So we'll start with the executive authority and the president. If the president comes in with an agenda like the Bush-Cheney administration does, there's, in terms of increasing and expanding our domestic energy development and reducing energy prices globally, there's many things that they can do in terms of wielding that executive authority to influence the behavior of the agencies that are regulating those types of development activities. You have to have a shared political objective in terms of the Congress. You have to have a Congress that agrees with that particular policy objective. They will do their best to carve out laws or create laws, carve out exemptions. They're incentivized because, quite frankly, if you carve out the exceptions, as has been done in this particular case, you've returned the responsibility for the environmental quality of the commons back over to the states. States get a tremendous amount of royalty, as does the federal government, in terms of that energy development. The persons who sit on the committees and subcommittees, generally speaking, come from energy-producing states, resource-using states. They're incentivized to bring that largesse to their states' budgets. Consequently, they're going to vote both at the federal level and they're going to influence the ability of states to necessarily impose the environmental quality regulations and laws that would, keep the commons safe and healthy. On the flip side of this, you've got the regulated interest groups who are pushing and trying to influence on both sides. They're trying to influence the executive branch action. They're trying to influence the congressional branch action. They're trying as hard as they can to get their preferred policy positions put into law or at least enacted so that the behavior of the agencies basically they give preference over to their activities. So I'm going to go into a bit of picture representation here and talk about technologies and markets and the laws and regulations and new technologies. So this is, obviously this looks like, this is West Texas back in the day. 2 minutes? Wow. Okay, this is what I get for going last. All right, so.
Yeah, you get the same time as everybody else.
All right, so this is West Texas. So you've got this West Texas, and you see the crowding, and there's basically 100 straws into one drink. And this is the technology that we had at the time. So we're going to employ that. We're going to create laws and regulations that help. This is hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling. So if you notice, dropping a straw is going to have an impact on the land. It's probably going to have an impact a little bit on the air and the water quality of the previous picture. But when you get into this type of technology and you're dumping oil, sand, chemicals into the ground, fracturing coal seams, and then withdrawing only 40% of what you're putting into the ground, and that's at the top margin, it takes 1.25 to 1.5 million gallons of water to actually frack one of these horizontal wells. You've got a number of carcinogens in the chemical compounds, although new technologies are being developed in terms of the organic nature of the compounds that are being used. They just finished a test in El Paso that went really well. But this idea that that's a hard-to-reach resource. It's one that was never really capable of being developed on a large scale. So we develop the technology, we go after the resource. To give you some sense of the sort of footprint, you can always drive by the road and look out and see a handful of wells or wind turbines or whatever it might be, but you really don't get a sense of the scale or scope until you take a 20,000-foot observation of really what's going on out there. So in Wyoming, if you notice, I put the scale up here, 1890 to 2000, they basically issued 70,000 approved permits to drill, and between 2000 and 2008, they went up to 115,000. Currently, it sits at an estimated roughly 187,000. This is a land out near the Jonah Field and near Pinedale, Wyoming. This is a picture representation of 2000, and this is that same area of land in 2007. So you can see the different well pads and the spacing that are occurring. This is all hydraulic fracturing activity that's occurring out on the public lands. I'm trying to go as fast as I can. This is, in a sense, what Pinedale, and had the close proximity to the town, its water resources. That is the Wind River wildlife, or should say, what is it, refuge, whatever it might, what is it? It's a wilderness area, sorry, wilderness area. And the headwaters, the glaciers up there, are the largest in the lower 48. But you've got VOCs, you've got water contamination, you've got all kinds of different things that are affecting those glaciers, and that is the headwater to the Green River up in those glaciers. You can literally go up there and drop your hat into the drip that comes off the glacier. That is the start of the Green River. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is tar sands. Here we go, tar sands, right? So we have the technology to go after the tar sands, and it's a different process than a hydraulic fracturing process, at least in the above ground. You can scrape, because tar sands are different than oil shale. So tar sands is basically scraping, heating, chemically processing, and then upgrading, and then moving the bitumen into refining process. This is what Alberta looks like right now. So again, the 20,000 foot level as to what this process and the compounding of the environmental impacts. So think back to that slide of all the different old oil derricks, then all the footprints from the hydraulic fracturing, and now this is what it's going to take, because this is a much more difficult resource to develop. Another representation of kind of before and after of that up in Alberta. Same here. You can see this is where John was, this idea that how do you replant that? How do you regrow that? Especially on that scale. That's very tremendously difficult. So we've decided that that's too impactful, so we're going to go after it in different ways. One way is kind of like the hydraulic fracturing process. We're going to drop steam, hot water into areas, into pockets, create chambers, and then withdraw the energy, separate it, and get the energy resource. This gives you some sense of the technology that's going to be deployed. It's actually being tested in the corners of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah currently. So they're testing this out. So this type of development will, unlike the ones in Alberta, this is the technology that they're proposing to put into the United States. So again, everywhere you find an oil shale or a coal formation, this is the type of technology that they're going to be looking to extract for oil. But they're also going to freeze it, which is rather interesting. This is the newest one. I just discovered this a few days ago. Every day is different. So they drill, they create an ice wall through the shale beds. They blow the topsoil up a little bit because this is shallow ground development, and then they'll separate the oil with the water and bring it to the surface. So to give you some sense of that. This is an active project, again, up in the corners of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, mostly out west. Most energy types of activities of this sort begin in the west, and in Texas sometimes. This is the project as it sits right now, so think about the footprints that are involved. It's a less footprint than the Alberta tar sands, but it's a footprint nonetheless. And this is the freezing process in wintertime. Let's see. So, Catherine and I are going to work on something here soon. And this is the idea of what happens if the XL Keystone Pipeline gets built, and the infrastructure, the economic markets, the political willpower all come together in that sense, and you expand the infrastructure, and in a sense you incentivize that expansion of tar sands and oil shale development. What impact is that going to have on climate change? What impact is that going to have on our ability to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels? Can anyone tell me what city that is?
Lubbock.
No.
In the future.
That's Salt Lake City, Utah. This is from last winter. We had the worst air quality in the United States, and we came very close to reaching Beijing levels. And this is up from the mountains that you can see. Yeah, okay. This is what it normally looks like. So all of that. So how do you change things? Well, one, you can reform how much influence is being played. This is the millions of dollars this is from 2008. This is from the 2008 election, and how much energy is using in terms of influencing, those policies. You can start with landscaping in terms of rooftops. So I wish he was still here, because this is what we're doing, right? You can create, and we are in the process of creating mass transit on a national scale, high-speed rail. So infrastructure. You can create organic communities. This idea that every house, every rooftop, every surface has a solar panel garden. Pocket parks have wind turbines, they've got geothermal, they've got solar. In a sense, you return the energy production back to the communities. The decisions about how it's being consumed and how it's being developed back to the communities. And obviously infrastructure. This is another sort of sense of what that would look like. So is anybody doing it? Well, yeah, we're putting solar panels on just about everything. We're putting them over canals, we're putting them over cotton fields or potato beds or various other types of things. We're putting them on ship containers, because ship containers sit forever. So we put turbines and we put solar panels. Every flat surface becomes an energy producing entity. We put solar panels on every roof. This wall is at the University of Utah. Those are solar ivy. So they're creating energy for the building in and of itself, but they look like ivy. It doesn't have to be panels. It can be it can take any shape that we want. And this is the most interesting. There is a project that's moving forward in California, and they're going to create, and I still wish David was here because he's talking about redoing the downtown. These are highways made from solar panels. So in a sense, you can drive on top of a solar panel and the highways become energy producers. Again, any surface, it's already there. It's how we consider, how we think about it. I won't get into this. I wanted to leave you with this comment, this quote from Barry Commoner. Today's private exploitation of nature is more concealed, pervasive, and threatening. This time the world is being plundered in secret, tied to the core processes and technology of capitalist production. The simple regulation of capitalism will no longer suffice. If productive technologies are to be altered to conform to environmental needs and natural processes, the means by which decisions about production and technology are made will themselves have to be changed. In a sense, we have to really start thinking outside the box. We have to think not in non-traditional terms if we're going to shift our energy policy, if we're going to get at the root cause of climate change. This is what's going to be required, a much more democratic and open discussion about the technologies that are being deployed to go after scarcer and scarcer fossil fuels. Thank you. Sorry, I went along.